Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Why did I decide to write a book about this? The basic story is this. I grew up in Dundee on the tail end of the 60s and into the 70s, and I grew up on the welfare state. Well, I was brought up by my grandmother. And because of that, and because things like schools worked, at least back then, and opportunities were actually opportunities, you're now looking at one of the greatest examples of social mobility within one generation you've ever seen, because I'm an Ivy League professor in the United States. Now, that's what's meant to happen. And all across the developed world, that's broken. It doesn't work. And we have chronic youth unemployment, and we have ladders of social mobility which are simply broken. And for capitalism to work, and actually I am a sort of like a bit of a fan, I have to admit, that's it. But for it to work, it actually has to have some sense of legitimacy. There has to be some sense that opportunities are not a winner-take-all game for the people who already have all the assets. And the hidden story of austerity I want to share with you today is how this is basically about reinsuring the assets and incomes of the people who already have the assets and the incomes, and how they're trying to put the bill for doing that on everybody else. And that's the first part we're going to talk about. So as you know, Europe is not in great fiscal health. So we have all this debt, and the story, of course, is, well, there's been this orgy of public spending, and we've all spent too much. Well, is that really the case? Is this how we got into this fine mess? Right? I do like that picture just for the sake of it. Well, really, what's going on, and this is the core of the first part of the book, is this. So the story of bond spreads in Europe, right, pretty dry technical topic, is actually quite fascinating, because the official story goes like this. Back in the day, when you were buying a 10-year Greek bond, you were getting paid 25%. Why? Because they haven't run a budget surplus in 50 years. They don't make anything. The country's empty once you get outside of Athens, and there's a pretty high default risk. Well, the Italians, the French, and everybody else jump around the same thing, 15 to 12%, because basically we know they cook the books and so on and so forth. So when you're buying their bonds, you actually are buying risk, and that's what you're getting paid for holding. But look at this convergence. Well, what happens here? Well, the euro comes in. And the official story goes, by basically giving up your printing press and handing it over to the Germans in Frankfurt, you become Germany in the following sense. You don't have default risk anymore because your exchange rate risk in terms of devaluation, right, taken off the table. You can't do it anymore. You can't inflate your way out of trouble. So if you can't devalue and you can't inflate your way out of trouble, the only thing left is, guess what? Balanced budget, structural reform. We're all going to go forward. Now, if you're a bank, you like that story, but it's also a bit of a problem, because back in the day, you got 25% for holding Greek bonds. They were thinly traded, but they were nice if you could get them. And when those countries have their own printing press and their banks get into trouble, the chances are they're going to bail them out. So you kind of have an insurance policy on your debt implicitly. Now, imagine that you know there's this thing called the euro coming in. And you know that there's a way that all those yields are going to compress, and you're not going to make money anymore off these bonds, and you do fixed income. What are you going to do? Well, what you want to do is take the balance sheet of your bank and turbocharge your bond buying. You want to get rid of all your German debt, all your Dutch debt, all the stuff that's already low yield, and you want to get your hands on as much periphery debt as you possibly can. And you want to pump up your balance sheet and run massive, massive leverage. So your average European bank today is twice the size and 3 times the asset footprint of its American counterpart. Deutsche Bank, for example, has 86% of German GDP and runs a leverage ratio operationally of about 44 to 1, which means that a 3% turn against its assets effectively renders it illiquid, if not insolvent. So you're turbocharging this lending project. Why? Because this is how you make money on a declining spread. Now, what happens in the periphery when you're buying all those bonds? You basically flood their local banking circuits. Suddenly, the price of money collapses. These guys have got more money than know what to do with them. What do? They buy German products. And so long as the savings in the north are going into the capital flows that emerge in the banks in the south, and you borrow against them, and everybody's borrowing against assets such as real estate, you have one hell of a party, but it's a credit bubble. And when the global credit bubble goes bang, you then have a problem. And that's why periphery Europe falls off a cliff, because essentially all the capital flows dried up. Now, if you're a bank sitting in the middle of this, is really bad, right? Because this obviously means that all those assets you've got are crap. But you've did a game on this. You've done the greatest moral hazard trade in human history. Now, why is this a moral hazard trade? Because ultimately I'll get bailed out by my state, right? And you go, but well, no, you can't. You gave away your printing press. You're in the euro. Remember, that's why the whole trade happened. Yeah, but there's a thing called the ECB. They'll bail me out, right? Because after all, I've just become a systemic risk generator. I don't take down the Greek banking system. I take down the whole goddamn lot. So I use systemic risk as a banking model to basically turbocharge my profits, because the ECB will bail me, right? Wrong. They were serious about that no bailout clause. And more to the point, the ECB doesn't have citizens, they have volunteers. This is why they can't do a Ben Bernanke, flush it with liquidity, swap out the assets, de-lever and recapitalise, because ultimately the money pump is called Germany, and you know what? They're not big enough to do it. You could take all of Germany's liquidity and flush it down the cistern of the European banking system, and it won't clean up the mess. So if you can't inflate, and you can't deflate, and you don't want to default because you'll have a bank run around your bond markets, all you've got left is austerity. Add liquidity, squeeze, and pray. And that's what they've been doing since 2009. So, given this, a little bit of an example, there is the GDP of the EU. That's the banking footprint. Good luck. If that goes bad, it's game over for the euro and the core banks, which is why you keep Greece in no matter what, and you keep squeezing and adding liquidity. It's pretty much all they've got. Now here's the fun part of this. What does this mean? It means it's about keeping the periphery in at all costs. It's all about stopping that bank run around the bond market. But the problem is you can't solve a banking problem with budget cuts. In fact, why would you even think you could? You can slash Greek public spending to Neolithic levels, and it's not going to do a damn thing for Societe Generale's balance sheet. Next one, you can't run a gold standard in a democracy. Well, you can try, and essentially if you think of the euro as a hard money constraint like a gold standard without gold, because you can't inflate and you can't devalue because you give away your printing press, that's where you are. We tried that in the 1930s. It didn't end too well. You can't solve a solvency problem with a liquidity instrument. You can keep pumping liquidity into dead banks, but at the end of the day, either the assets are coming back or they're not. Anybody want to buy some collateralized Spanish real estate loans? I didn't think so. And finally, and this is the real austerity lesson, you cannot all cut at once and expect to grow. It's really simple. It's a simple numerator-denominator problem, right? So imagine the following. So you've got an 80% debt to GDP ratio, European average. And let's say the government spends 40% of GDP. So that means that if you're going to cut half of government expenditure, you're going to take basically 20% of the economy out with you. Now imagine a constant stock of debt. Turn 80%, 0.8 into 4 over 5. And then take 20% out of the 5. You now went to 4 over 4. So when you cut, and everybody does it simultaneously, what happens is that the denominator gets smaller and the numerator reciprocally gets bigger. So a constant stock of debt gets bigger over time the more you cut. This is why every European country that's undergone an austerity project now has more debt rather than less. And the ones who have cut the most are the ones who have the biggest pile of accumulated debt. It's not that it just doesn't work, it's actually self-defeating. Now, if this is the case, why did anybody, especially in Europe, ever think this is a good idea? First one, John Locke. Go all the way back to the 5th chapter, the invention, if you will, of property. Because there's a dirty little secret here, basically, that you need the state to make markets, right? What was the English Revolution about, if not the establishment of civil magistracy, the establishment of private property, enclosure, the right to dispose of one's property, breaking the contract of the medieval period? That's what the game was. And the problem is, of course, is when you let markets do what markets do, you end up with huge amounts of inequality. I'll jump to Smith in a minute, but let me give you a great line from Smith on this. For every rich man there will be 500 poor, and were it not for the strong hand of the civil magistrate everywhere, he would be attended by jealousy and his assets would be insecure. Another line from Smith, this is my favourite line from Smith, civil government, insofar as it is instituted for the defence of the rich against the poor, or for those who have property against those who have none. Not Karl Marx, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, back end of book 2. Go check it out. Now what is it you get with Locke? The first inkling that there's a problem here, because any state that's strong enough to protect your property can come after your property. Hence the American Second Amendment, right? So right built into liberalism from the start is this weird relationship with the state. You need it to keep you safe, but at the same time you don't trust it from not robbing you blind. Two people who get a hold of this are David Hume and Adam Smith. Basically what David Hume figures out is a kind of way of paying for this problem, because you can't trust the state, but at the same time you need it. And more importantly, if you want one that's big enough to protect you properly, you're going to have to pay for it, but that means paying taxes, and you don't like that. So there's a free option out there, or it seems free, which is called debt. Fabulous. You give the money to the state gives you all the money back 10, 15 years later and pays you interest for the whole thing. Downside on this, unfortunately, you're going to have to offer a rate of interest greater than you would get out there doing anything else. And as Hume's worry was, this will chase all of the gold and silver from the circulation of commerce into debt securities. Everyone will become a buyer of debt. What will happen is that the price will fall, the yield will go up, you'll crowd out all the capital in the nation, the underlying economy will shrink under this debt burden, and we'll all end up bankrupt. Sound awfully familiar as an argument? It's because it's the same argument. Adam Smith adds a nice little twist. He says, well, what about taxes? Why can't we do taxes? And he opens up his discussion of taxes by saying that people with skin in the game should pay more taxes. So the more that you own, the more the state protects you, the more you should actually pay. Very progressive in a sense. And in he realizes that him and his mates will end up paying all the taxes, so he doesn't like that. So he immediately switches gear and says, well, what about a national consumption tax? Oddly, exactly what Paul Ryan is arguing for in the US right now. Funny that, isn't it? But he then realizes that's not going to pay enough money. So what are you going to do? Well, you're stuck with debt. Because this is the thing, and you're going to drag you down. So there's this inevitability of the accumulation of debt, but at the same time, this terror, this fear that it's going to drag you down. Now, the funny thing about this, of course, is they were right in the sense that they said the crushing burden of debt at the time that they wrote, in the 1770s, is going to destroy the British nation. And sure enough, it went up from around 10% of GDP to 264% of GDP by 1815. So, in 1815, obviously, Britain died, right? No, it went on to dominate the entire planet for a century. And it did so partly because of imperialism, but also because of the growth of the economy despite the debt. 90%, I don't think so, right? So what actually happens? Well, basically by 1867, they're back in single digits on debt. And they did this because they were growing. When you're growing, you can pay back your bills. When you're shrinking, your bills just get bigger. So despite the prognostications, despite the warning, despite the fact that this is an intuitively plausible story that we keep telling ourselves today, it is factually, flatly wrong. And the biggest surprise I had in discovering this, when going through the whole book, is there isn't a single positive case in the whole historical record of austerity leading to less debt rather than more. Britain, again, in 1931, 170% debt to GDP. 1933, 190% debt to GDP. After World War II, 246% of GDP. 10 years later, because of growth, under 100. Another 5 years out, under 40. It's a pretty straightforward story. Moving along, the result of this is what I call the can't live with it, can't live without, and don't want to pay for it problem of the state. Liberalism's neuralgia and the aspirin of austerity. So what does this do? In the 19th century, this splits into two tracks. One's David Ricardo, down there go the Austrian economists. I'm not even going to talk about the state. I'm going to pretend it's not there. I'm just going to assume perfectly flexible wages and prices. On the other side, you get John Stuart Mill, who needs to the new liberalism and ultimately to Keynesianism, and that's one of the tracks, the stories I tell in the book. Where the rubber hits the road in the first time is with Schumpeter, who's running Harvard economics department at that point in time. And this is the whole notion of liquidationism and the famous phrase of Andrew Mellon, let the farms go bankrupt, let the businesses go bankrupt, purge the rottenness out of the system, and more competent people will come along and pick things up. Well, we waited around for 14 years, and the more competent seemed to be on an extended lunch break. It didn't actually work out too well. But the basic idea was that the modern business cycle theory, as it called, was essentially that things go up, things go down, we don't know why, technology seems to be important, and you should just let things unfold, because ultimately in the long run it will all be fine. And the problem with this whole thing, of course, is the fact that in the long run during the 20s and 30s it seemed that we weren't actually fine at all. We kind of got stuck there. But nonetheless, this binge and purge of austerity motif that we still get today comes from strong Schumpeterian roots. The British had their own version of this, of course. It's more refined. We don't do binging and puking. We actually just have a nice thing called the Treasury view. And the basic idea was essentially, that's Churchill with the little box, right? Was the basic idea there was a reply to Lloyd George's "Can we do something about unemployment" memo, and Keynes and Henderson write this thing together, saying perhaps we could do public works, and they come out with essentially the same arguments that you get in Hume and Smith, with a little twist on what's called Ricardian equivalence, that basically any debt raised today to produce goods today to boost the economy today will be paid with tax increases later on, so the whole thing zero-sum against itself. So you should never try in the first place. So if you do crowding out plus, you drown over debt, sort of hyper-convex, it falls off a cliff, and then you do this, you've basically got all the arguments we're still using today, and they come out of basically from the 1700s to the 1920s. There was an alternative to this, and we like to think it all started with Keynes' general theory, but I do like Joan Robinson's line on this, which was Mr. Keynes was telling us what caused unemployment at the same time that Mr. Hitler was curing it. And a lot of this actually has to do with facts on the ground, because when you have simultaneous contractions of the 5 biggest economies in the world in the 1930s, you end up with more debt rather than less. 2 of those economies end up producing fascism, that being Germany and Japan. This didn't work out very well. And the result of all this is that you get an ordo-liberal home for austerity. That is to say, the idea that budget cuts are the way forward, you should balance the budget, the anti-Keynesian response dies everywhere except one place, Germany. Now, why does it stay like this in Germany? Because the German economy is more like Japan than it is like any other European economy. It is based around big firms, it is based around exports, it is based around high-quality diversified production, and it always has done. And that means the source of demand for your economy is not generated by your spending at home, it's generated elsewhere. There aren't enough Germans to buy all those BMWs, you've got to sell them to somebody else. Now, if that's the case, what do you want in your economy? Do you want to pump up domestic demand? Absolutely not, because all you'll do is raise wages. And that's going to mean the BMW is going to get more expensive, and eventually you'll stop buying them abroad. So what do you need? A very strong monetary authority, a very strong competition authority, and a set of rules to make competition effective. Now, where else have you heard that story? It's called the EU. So they got to design the architecture of the EU, and the architecture of the EU is all about the Commission being stronger than the Parliament, sound money much more important than domestic level of output or employment, rules, the importance of rules as opposed to the discretion of politicians, the importance of competitiveness over notions of complementarity. So in other words, you're not an optimal currency area, it doesn't matter, we'll build the institutions later and we'll all get there. And then now notions of fiscal treaties which have debt breaks, Schuldenbremsen and various other things built into it. This is a German architecture. Now, why is this a problem? It's a problem because it's a bit like Switzerland. Switzerland can only be Switzerland because everyone else isn't Switzerland, right? To be a haven, you have to have places that are not havens, right? And to turn all of Europe in one model into the German model runs into the problem that Martin Wolf and the FT beautifully identified. Who's going to buy all this stuff? Right, if the whole country basically reduces its wage costs, has very low inflation, retools, does structural reform, let's say it totally works, right? We go through a decade of hell, but eventually you get there. Who's going to buy all this stuff? Martians? The whole of the Europe can't run a positive trade surplus against the rest of the world. That's insane. It works for Germany, but it doesn't work for everybody if you try it. And we're trying it now because what was really going on when we have built all this stuff were those capital flows and credit flows I talked about at the beginning, with the banks sending savings from the north to consumers in the south to buy products made in the north, which then kept the whole thing going. And once the credit bubble went bang, all you're left with is this architecture. And that architecture is inherently deflationary for an entire continent. Last part of the story, and this very quickly, where did these ideas come from? Luigi Einaudi, back in the 1950s, becomes the first Prime Minister of modern Italy. He's also the head of the Bank of Italy. He also set up the Bocconi School of Public Finance in Milan. Back in the 70s, there was a thing called the Cambridge Capital Controversy, some of you might have remembered, whereby Cambridge here had a big fight with Cambridge in the United States. The Americans won. Well, maybe not. But they actually won in the following sense. People stopped listening to the Cambridge people. And because of that, mathematics became way, way more technical in the way you do economics. At that point in time, the only people in Europe who could effectively talk to the Americans, because they were so teched up, the Bocconi guys. So the Bocconi undergraduates and master's students started to go to America to do their PhDs. And the whole argument Bocconi had was basically a public finance argument that the state is always and everywhere bad and you should cut it, because if you cut it, it'll lead to more growth. Where do you get that today? This is the current head of the Harvard Economics Department. His name is Alberto Alessina. He's a Bocconi grad. Mario Monti, Bocconi grad. Mario Draghi, Bocconi grad. Where are you getting these ideas from? I don't know. Seems a bit Italian to me. So they take the cases from the 1980s that basically they talk about a lot, Ireland, Sweden, Canada, Denmark, and convince us that they all tried to, they cut, and then they all grew. Look in the book, I go through every single case, it's not true. They grew, then they cut. They get the causation backwards. That happens a lot in econometric research. So basically this gets written into the ECB's report in June 2010. It's the basis of Troika conditionality agreements for the periphery. It's the structure of bailouts, the whole lot. And the result at the end of it is what I call the greatest bait and switch in human history. Because if you go back to it, what happened? A bunch of banks got really, really over-levered. And they blew up, effectively. But you have a fake central bank that can't basically do anything to relieve the asset burden in the banks. So you add liquidity, you squeeze, and you pray. The American and British version of this is slightly different, and it's a bit more honest, because what you've done is you've taken all that private debt and dumped it directly in the public sector balance sheet. And now the trick is who's going to pay for it. So austerity round one is, let's give it to everyone at the end of the income distribution, the poor end, they can pay for it. Problem is they don't have any money, because they've been living off a credit bubble. That's the number one reason austerity can't work. There just isn't enough cash at the bottom end of the income distribution to pay for it. Now, what do you do next? Well, in Europe, you can't do anything. You're stuck. You're just adding liquidity, squeezing, and praying. What are you doing here? Where are we going? Well, you've got to find somebody who's got money. Who's got money? Why is the chairman of Apple in the Senate getting raked over the coals? Why are we tightening up on Luxembourg? Why are we going after Switzerland? There are 5 sinkholes of globalization in the world. We've been encouraging people with excess wealth to put their money for the past 30 years. How many divisions does the Cayman Islands have? We know where the money is. Austerity doesn't work. We're coming for it. That's the next act. Thank you.
Of course, this is a different situation in terms of previous crises, because we've got other major players in the global market that aren't in the same position as us at all, don't suffer from the same issues, don't have the same incentives. China in particular, but also other developing economies. How much does their power, their prominence, complicate the solutions that you're talking about?
I actually think that the whole China thing's vastly overblown for the following reason. They're a giant Germany. They live and die by exports. Now, they know this, and they know that they're trying to engineer their society over the next 10 years. They have a 10-year plan. You've got to love the hubris. The 5-year plans aren't big enough. Let's have a 10-year plan. And the 10-year plan, which they're pretty good at implementing, is to basically produce a very large healthcare system and upgrade their education system. Now, what does that do to a country with a high savings rate? It becomes a consumption subsidy so that they spend more. And when they spend more, and you've got 1 billion consumers, you get weaned off of exports, you're less dependent on holding dollars, you can have endogenous growth that way, and that's what they're trying to do. And good luck to them if they do it, because it would be good for the world economy. It would lead to a lot of rebalancing. But it's a hell of a trick, and it's going to take at least 10 years to do it. In the meantime, the Americans have struck the best deal in human history. For the past 30 years, we've been handing to the Japanese and the Chinese bits of paper bearing 2%, and they give us televisions. Right? So we call them a currency manipulator. Yes, they do. They have to run their currency just shy of the dollar. They basically import the American inflation rate so that their products are competitive. And you know what they do when we buy all that stuff from them with those bits of paper? They then come back and buy our debt. So we own them. So I don't really worry about them, because they'll get in line because they have to. 70% of global consumption comes out of the United States and the EU. The EU is harming itself to death through austerity. That's but it's a bigger problem for China in the long run than it's going to be for the United States. So I see it in rather different terms.